You're listening to China Africa Talk.
Jambo, ni Bridget akikuletea kipindi kinachohusiana na China na Afrika.
Vous écoutez le dialogue sino-africain avec Bridget.
Everything China, everything Africa.
Olá, você está ouvindo China Africa Talk com Bridget.
سيداتي وسادتي مرحبا بكم في الحوار الصيني العربي مع بريدجيت.
Delegates from around the world have gathered in Nairobi for the highest level global forum on environmental issues. The 7th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, or UNEA-7, aims to accelerate global action to address mounting environmental crises, advancing sustainable solutions for a resilient planet. At a time when geopolitical tensions are rising and multilateral cooperation is being tested, why does the mandate of UNEA-7 matter more than ever? What role can this assembly play in strengthening global environmental governance and building long-term planetary resilience? To answer these questions and more, I'm now joined by Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, and Ali-Said Matano, Executive Director of the Africa Center for Health, Environment and Water Services, as well as Senior Advisor to the Governor of Kisumu County in Kenya. Gentlemen, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'll begin our discussion there with you, Dr. Matano. As the highest level global forum on the environment, what are the most actionable and consequential outcomes we can realistically expect UNEA-7 to deliver for coordinated global action against climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution?
UNEA is quite significant given that it is the highest level decision-making body on environment globally. Now, what we really expect from such high-level meetings, Bridget, is basically on resolutions.
Okay.
Number one, I would expect that the resolutions will provide clear global priorities on of course, the triple planetary crisis that you have mentioned, that is climate change, biodiversity loss, as well as pollution. This should be very, very clearly spelled in the resolution. And given that most of the countries are signatories to a number of multilateral environmental agreements, such as the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, as well as Convention on Biodiversity, a clear global priority setting along those particular relevant measures would be very important if this is sounded in the resolution. Secondly, of course, I would expect the resolutions that would be arrived at address the issue of accelerated phase out of high-risk pollution. And especially here in Africa, we are talking of pollution and pesticides. This needs to be addressed because plastic are still a menace, especially in most of the third world countries, as well as there are quite a number of pesticides, especially from the West, which are still being applied in Africa, yet they are actually legal and have already been banned in the northern part of the globe. And therefore, a resolution should be there to address that. And then I also expect, given problems or the challenges we are facing in terms of ecosystem degradation, we want to see a resolution that actually addresses enhanced ecosystem restoration, and not only on terrestrial areas, but also aquatic ecosystem, both water and land ecosystem. These ecosystems are very, very important, and yet they are facing very, very high risk. And of course, given that UNEP is having more and more mandate, we would expect the mandate there, a resolution that addresses the issues of United Nations Environmental Program, as well as maybe addressing the aspect of funding. And finally, of course, we expect a resolution that would expand support to regions vulnerable to climate change and pollution. I'm looking at areas like Africa itself, Asia, and also I'm looking at Latin America, which are quite vulnerable to climate change.
Mr. Ma, China has integrated the concept of ecological civilization into its development model. From your analysis, how are China's domestic environmental achievements and policy innovations influencing the ambition and framing of global solutions within the UNEA-7 negotiations?
Yeah, China's concept of ecological civilization that has made its impact. I just came back from another big meeting, the COP30, held in Milan, Brazil. And this time, unlike in some of the earlier COP where, the China pavilion usually mostly have the Chinese audience, this time there are many foreigners. With all these side meetings, many foreigners, and particularly the audiences from the global south. And the participants are really interested in what's going on in China, guided by the ecological civilization. China has set target on not just to peak and neutralize the carbon emission, but also try to build a beautiful China. The sub-targets include climate action, pollution control, expansion of grain, and high-quality growth. So I think these targets are all, resonate with the participants, particularly from the global south, because they are facing similar challenges.
Yes.
For example, on the air quality, environment quality side, air pollution, water pollution, many other countries also face this problem. And in China, over the past 12, 13 years, massive actions have been rolled out and improvement of air and water quality. And I heard from colleagues and friends from the global south that this is what they want, because, to wait for half a century until they have the per capita GDP reach kind of a middle developed country level. So they want to learn from what China has been doing. And also, of course, China also made big strides in reforestation and forestation, making contribution to about 25% of the global newly added greening zones. And I think the best part is that China managed to align this with the development target, through all the major investment and development of renewable energy and related technologically intensive industries like the EVs and batteries. China managed to create its own logic to continue the climate action. So it's not climate action for climate's sake.
Okay.
It's for the real benefits of the societies. I think all of this have its impact on the ambition to frame the UNEA negotiations. And I was part of the expert group between UNFCCC and UNEA-7, which is focused on so-called synergy. Of all this climate action with SDG target. And the report we created will also be submitted at the UNEA-7. I hope that will arouse some discussion, and hopefully it will be helpful.
Now, I'm going to ask this question to both of you. Perhaps I'll begin with you there, Dr. Matano. We are seeing countries push back against mentioning plastics and climate change in UNEA's medium-term strategy. Similar tensions exist at climate COPs and other forums. Is multilateralism in environmental governance breaking down, and why does UNEA's mandate still matter?
Yeah, indeed, we can actually see pushbacks. But what I would want to say is whether the pushbacks on plastic, climate change linkages, or even on finances, I believe this is not a collapse of multilateralism, but it reflects some critical aspects that are happening globally. One, it is a reflection of divergence in national interest, especially between major commodity producers and also climate vulnerable countries. Like there are countries which depend heavily on utilization of natural resources, especially in Africa.
Yes.
And they see this as being, an area that is going again to affect their income. Now, the other area that this observation reflects is basically the geopolitical library. We have seen the North and the South, especially during environmental negotiation, there is a bit of rivalry. The observation that you have also mentioned is also a reflection of fear of new obligation that may affect trade, industry, and even domestic politics. And I want to highlight the aspect of domestic politics. Like in Africa, of course, where I am in the East African region, we know that anything that affects people's livelihood, whether it contributes positively to environmental conservation, whether it compromises the ability to climate resilience, but as long as it is affecting the livelihood of the people, the politician would rather go for it. In fact, politicians would rather support the use of plastics as opposed to maybe to banning it, because during the politics, it is the economic value that matters, not really what is this? And therefore, and of course, finally, you will agree with me, Bridget, that there is negotiation fatigue. We have seen a lot of multiple processes like the COPs that I've mentioned. So there is some aspect of fatigue, negotiation fatigue that is apparent, and this could be looked at and probably be misconstrued as a collapse of multilateralism. But I don't think that that is the collapse of multilateralism. And I want to emphasize that UNEA's mandate still matters today as it was when it was established. It still matters. And what we are witnessing is, however, the dynamism or the pragmatism is now required more than any other time in order to accommodate emerging issues such as global realignment in trade, as well as science and technology, among many other things that are emerging, so that the mandate of UNEA still remains relevant. Otherwise, if there is no dynamism and pragmatism in the leadership of UNEA, then sooner or later, people might see that it is actually not relevant to them, or it doesn't really matter.
I'd like to know your thoughts there, Mr. Ma.
Yeah, first, I agree. On the one hand, we are facing fragmentation of the global environmental governance. We know some country, some big emitter even withdrew from the Paris Agreement again. And all this could impede the international cooperation. And I think the stability and credibility of multilateral environmental mechanism is being undermined. So global transition toward green and low carbon development is showing signs of wavering. We see that at COP30 as well. But on the other hand, multilateralism is still our best hope.
Okay.
As Singer Anderson, head of UNEP, put it, even in turbulent times, environmental multilateralism continued to deliver. Since last UNEA, and the governments agreed to establish intergovernmental science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution. This means finally, IPCC on climate and IPBES on biodiversity. Finally, they decided to work together to align their rules and standards, and the agreement on sustainable use of marine biodiversity came into force. I think that's another major victory. And if we don't have multilateral process, then it could be much more difficult. But of course, amid all this volatile international landscape, China has remained committed to the vision. I think China, along with Europe and many others, continue to be committed. I think that's extremely important. They serve as the anchor in the time of this such a big uncertainty.
Dr. Matano, like many regions, Africa is a climate vulnerable continent. How is Africa leveraging this platform to champion the continent's vision for a sustainable and resilient future, particularly in areas like green industrialization and climate adaptation?
Yes, that's also important because, first of all, we are lucky that the 7th session of UNEA is actually taking place in Africa. This shows the prominence of this particular assembly to Africa. The way I see it is that we are going to use this particular assembly as a strategic platform to shape global environmental priorities, not just in Africa, but globally, ensure equity in climate action. There is a lot of climate action that is taking place, but really it lacks equity. As well, of course, we expect to use the assembly to advance the continent's vision on what you have said about green industrialization, resilience, and also inclusive growth. And you would agree with me, and also my co-guest Ma would also agree with me, that the influence in UNEA itself has grown significantly. And I would attribute this one because of the unified position that Africa has taken of lately. Then I would also attribute it to strong regional blocs. And therefore, the influence of Africa in the assembly to be more significant. And of course, most importantly, we feel that why our influence at UNEA has grown is because of the moral authority as the world's most climate vulnerable continent, yet least responsible for global emission. That is from a moral perspective. Yet the effects of climate change and other environmental risks or environmental probably disasters, Africa takes a huge portion of it. So there is that moral authority that Africa has, and it has to be listened by UNEA. As Africa, we are using this particular UNEA to privilege things like speaking with one strong, one united voice, and we can also leverage our participation in UNEA by using the same forum to promote green industrialization, which is quite nascent in Africa, as well as even a circular economy transition that we are already seeing taking place in Africa. We could also leverage on this particular assembly by championing adaptation, resilience, and even financing reforms, as well as advancing blue economy and the protection of water basins. Therefore, we are really using this forum as positioning Africa as a global energy transition hub.
Mr. Ma, the first Women's Environment Assembly in the region was held ahead of UNEA-7. Scholarly analysis shows that environmental policy often treats gender as a separate issue. Now, in your view, which negotiation areas, climate finance mechanisms, or technology transfer protocols most systematically exclude women's perspectives by design? What is the structural remedy?
Yeah, I think the most profound exclusion happens where the money flows and technologies are defined. And because the design replicates existing economic power structures. And on the technology transfer and development protocols, I think there are some design flaw on that because the transfer is dominated by patented hardware-centric technologies, but overlooks social technologies where women are often primarily knowledge holders. So the remedy, I think, is to mandate gender justice as a performance criterion, not just a side event, and to reshape this instrument to recognize value and amplify women's agency as indispensable to the environmental stability. So with that, I really congratulate the first Women's Environmental Assembly.
Dr. Matano, finance is chronically inadequate and often fails to reach local authorities and communities. What needs to change? What role do you see for UNEA?
Yes. At any given time when you start talking of UN assemblies, the first agenda that comes up very, very quickly is climate financing.
Yes.
And indeed, I totally agree with you. It has actually become chronicle, and one, it is adequate, and also in terms of the resource being accessed by the local people down and even communities is almost a mirage. And therefore, this is something that unless it is addressed, will keep on recurring. And indeed, I see UNEA having a role in changing this paradigm shift. From my point of view, what needs to change at UNEA is really structural reforms on the management of climate finance.
Okay.
I'm saying this on the background that UNEA itself is not in control of climate financing. But I do believe it has a big role in terms of influencing, and it can actually play what we call catalytic role that can actually even bring in some changes. Nevertheless, there is an urgent need globally to scale up volume of financing. At the moment, if you look at most of the reports, you'll find that the commitments has been around 100 billion commitments to climate financing for that matter. Africa has been pushing around 280 billion. And specifically for adaptation. And therefore, if you look at that commitment that is globally made of 100 billion, again, it's just one call from Africa on one specific area, that is adaptation, and not even including mitigation, then you find that indeed there is a need to scale up the volume of finance that goes to climate actions. There is also an urgent need to reform access and delivery mechanisms. This, everybody would agree with me, even
I agree.
Mama would agree with this. It is very, very, very complex to access and even to have these resources or climate financing, mostly in the third world countries, because the aspect of it in terms of even disbursement, management, and even application is quite complex. Thirdly, I think we need to shift more of the climate finances to grants. We need more grants and less loan for Africa. And finally, I'm looking at how we can realign climate finance with the national and subnational planning.
There's a gap there.
Yes, there's that need to realign that particular finance with the national and, of course, subnational planning. National planning, you are aware, there is what we call the national determined contribution. So climate finance should be supportive of the NDCs. And at the subnational level, like in Kenya, we are looking at it supporting what we plan after every 5 years under the county integrated development plans. That realignment would be very important, and that would partly address what we have talked about, the challenges in terms of the finances reaching local authorities as well as communities. I still see UNEA playing a key role, and as I've just alluded to, the fact that UNEA has no direct control over climate financing, but it can play a critical role, especially in pushing for accessible and inclusive finances. They can actually lobby for that. Also, they can play a role in encouraging simplified access windows to funds like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund, and also Adaptation Fund, which actually are common. Finally, of course, UNEA can mandate UNEP, which is our closest institution here, to support the subnationals in readiness and project preparation.
Again, I'm going to ask this question to both of you. I'll begin there with you, Mr. Ma. Recent UNEP data shows that emissions continue to rise and the impacts of global environmental and climate change are accelerating and growing more extreme. Now, despite the alarming data, we see new forms of leadership emerging globally. What tangible shifts do you see that provide a credible and hopeful foundation for accelerating action in this critical decade?
I think the alarming data and the emerging leadership is as you just the coexistence of that is precisely where the most important dynamics of this critical decade there, and we have seen some hopeful foundations and some tangible shifts forming hopeful foundations. And one of that is the economic and technological tipping point. On the renewable energy, we have seen solar, wind, and batteries are now the cheapest form of the new electricity generation. So IEA, they projects renewables to become the largest source of global electricity by 2025. Right. And this isn't just policy, it's just simple economics. I think that brings a lot of hope. And of course, electric vehicle, and we know that in China, so much attention has been paid on this. The penetration rate is getting close to 50%. And in more recent years, China is paying attention to electrify the heavy-duty trucks, which are major emitters. Of course, industrial decarbonization also is going on. On the financial system realignment, we see some progress, although there are still major gaps. We see more and more commitment from some of the largest financial institutions. We see globally new rules have been set up on the mandatory climate disclosure. ISSB, EU, and China. China aligned its own rules with the ISSB disclosure rules. So with that, we started compiling billions of tons of corporate carbon emission, which has been measured and disclosed. So I think that's also very positive. So all these are the new developments that continue to bring all this hope. Of course, a critical gap remains, particularly the speed and scale. We're on the right direction, but we move too slow. That's the conclusion drawn at the COP30. And to achieve that, back to the experience and lessons learned from China, China managed to cut its sulfur dioxide emission from 20 million tons to 2.4 million in 10 years of time. This shows that speed and scale can be achieved if we do it the right way. All of this started from massive monitoring and disclosure. The transparency actually helped to enable and empower a broad range public participation and tap into the market capacity. And this multi-stakeholder effort eventually can deliver a faster and better result.
I'd like to know your thoughts there as well, Dr. Matano.
Thank you, Bridget. I think this is very interesting because it actually shows the nexus between science and decision making. The more there is rise in emissions, the more impact globally we have. But of course, the impact is uneven. And the impact of Africa, for example, on environmental and climate change, we are seeing more drought, flooding. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that there are real and measurable shifts in policy, in technology, in finance, and even public expectations that actually signal a new wave of global leadership.
Okay.
And this is very important because if the global leadership would be able to make their decisions based on the data that has actually been collected, and there is massive data on this, then I expect to see a new wave of global leadership.
Right.
So of course, these shifts, though uneven as I've said, it does form a credible foundation for accelerating environmental action over the next decade, as you have said. You can see sometimes there is normally a disconnect between the leadership and also the data that is available. If you look, for example, a country like America, there is a bit of a disconnect between data that is available and the leadership. Probably the leadership is not very comfortable with the data that is coming up, and sometimes they don't think these data are meant for something. But again, if you look on the flip side of it, the other global power, like, for example, China. China is regarded as one of the biggest emitters, but there is a lot of leadership in terms of addressing both at mitigation level and even at adaptation level, because if you look at the statistics, the data that we are talking about, China is actually leading in some very, very important areas, like even issues of solar, clean energy. For me, I think that is the direction to go. And therefore, it is like there is already a balance between what is happening in terms of emission contribution and mitigation measures, other than leadership that would probably just throw away and say there is nothing like climate change. Over the next 10 years, I envision a number of tangible actions that would contribute to what we are already, our discussion here. And I actually see renewed political momentum. Okay. In the next 10 years, I anticipate or I envision acceleration in clean energy transitions, which we are already seeing. I also see a rise in circular economy. And of course, technology breakthrough, like now in Nairobi, I see a number of vehicles on e-mobility. So that transition is already taking place. And therefore, we are actually sort of like now consumers of breakthrough in technology.
Whoever thought you could measure leadership through environmental and climate change?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Ma, looking at the China-Africa partnership, what existing or collaborative models best exemplify how this cooperation can deliver mutually beneficial, resilient, and locally empowering outcomes for both sides?
Yeah, I think China and Africa has a long history of cooperation. Yeah. And in more recent years, I see this cooperation being expanded. And it's not only just between the governments, it's actually also powered by the market force. I think the most effective way, in some way, is for China to lead by action. The successes in China to address the social issues like poverty and education, and also climate and pollution problem. I think all of this have become some sort of models for some countries in Africa. One example is to show how important energy and transportation infrastructure can be in social economic development. So in recent years, we see China got involved in helping Africa to build more infrastructure. This has been neglected for too long in that promising continent. I think some countries already got benefited through that. As China-Africa partnership continue to evolve, we hope to see it moving beyond just the resource for infrastructure narratives. The most promising collaborative model today, I think, should be those that aim for structural transformation, skill transfer, and resilience. We see some examples. Some models are shifting from just financing and building to co-investing, co-managing, and co-owning value chains, such as the agro-industrial park, some of the green energy co-development, and some of the digital ecosystem models. So I think the ultimate test and will be whether the partnership fosters a generation of African technical experts, managers, and entrepreneurs who can operate and innovate within this new system, and whether it enables African economies to move up global value chain while managing their own ecological risks. I think that kind of people-centered development, it's something that's happening in some way in China, but it all started from education. So I hope that the two sides can work together to enhance the education in Africa.
Dr. Matano, the recurring criticism of such forums is the gap between resolution and action. Now, what makes the outcome of UNEA-7 different, and what single time-bound deliverable would you personally track to measure its success or failure 1 year from now?
Because the basis is actually on the medium-term strategy 2026 to 2029, I expect this UNEA to come up with some different resolution that would actually address more of implementation than on action. The metric or the measurement tool that I would use for the next year, or what I would really be very keen to see in the next 1 year after this UNEA-7 assembly here in Nairobi, is that I shall actually evaluate, assess whether UNEP, which is next here, has operationalized a dedicated access window or a mechanism that channels resources directly to subnational authority for locally led adaptation and pollution reduction. That is measurable.
Now, just to wind off our discussion, Mr. Ma, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. What has been the impact, though, of this agreement?
Last month, I attended the Paris Peace Forum, and at the meeting, those who oversighted the signing of the Paris Agreement participated, and together we reviewed the impact. And obviously, it has done a lot for the world. Without this, more than 190 countries coming together to sign this agreement, the world could face a prospect of some sort of 4 to 5 degree temperature rise. We all know that if it is beyond 1.5 or 2, it already could be disastrous. So you can imagine, 4 degree, if the temperature rise will be like the business normal will lead us to that dangerous future. So we all should give credit for this Paris Agreement. We, of course, China and Africa and, of course, the United States and Europe all played their roles in this, in the signing of that. Having said that, we all, as said, we're on the right direction, but the speed and scale is not quite there. We're still facing a temperature rise, which is going to be quite risky for the world. And the target of 1.5, we will see that being exceeded for at least a couple of decades, a few decades already. There will be overshoot. So it means that we have to try to do more to come to carbon neutrality and hopefully bringing the temperature rise under control by the end of this century.
I'd like to thank you again for your time. That brings us to the end of this discussion.
Thank you, Brigitte. Yeah, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Listeners, you can subscribe to our online newsletter on CGTN or Substack to get more insights on China-Africa relations. Just search China-Africa Talk. For now, it's goodbye. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others. Post it on social media or leave a rating and review. Thanks again. See you next time.